Hey everybody, this is the stuff at the beginning, like the preface and any kind of like preface notes and table of contents and whatnot of the story of a great discovery, how Marx wrote Capital by Vitali, what's that middle name? Solomonovich Vygodski. Yeah. This was published in the GDR in 1973. This is part of me trying to read through a lot of the source material that's in Jan Hoff's Marx Worldwide. So here is the table of contents. Forward to the German edition. Instead of an introduction, how, quote, Capital, Marx's Capital is created. The sections are, is it necessary to know the background to Capital? The main stages. Why is the period from 1850 to 1863 so interesting? Marx's creative laboratory. Chapter 1 is titled Standpoint for Observing Bourgeois Society. The theoretical luggage with which Marx arrived in London in August 1849. The poverty of philosophy and wage labor and capital, the nucleus of Marx's economic theory and the point of departure for further research, the theory of value and surplus value of the classic bourgeois economists and their fundamental shortcomings, Marx's application of the materialist conception of history to political economy, why the study of the subject matter had to begin again, quote, right from the start, unquote. Chapter 2 is titled A Mont Blanc of Facts. And the sections are Marx's economic studies, investigation of crises, the notebooks, quote, ... one is received not with compliments but with economic categories, end quote. First results of the economic investigations. Quote, basically there has been no progress in this science since Adam Smith and David Ricardo, end quote. The presuppositions for revolutionary transformation in political economy. The, quote, Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, quote, critique of Proudhonism, quote, communism must rid itself of all of this, quote, communism must rid itself above all of this, quote, false brother, end quote, end quote. Chapter 3, the, quote, economic self-form, end quote, of bourgeois society. And the sections are, why the outlines of the critique of political economy begins with the chapter on money, on the track of value, the, quote, degradation of money by the Proudhonists, the concept of necessary labor, value and price, the divisibility of a commodity and its two factors, the twofold character of labor in bourgeois society, in search of the, quote, economic self-form, end quote, the material content and social form of each and every economic phenomenon. Chapter 4, how, quote, he caught the surplus value robbers red-handed, end quote. And the sections are, quote, by the way, things are developing nicely, end quote, from value to surplus value, the analysis of exchange between labor and capital, labor power as a commodity, the mechanism of capitalist exploitation, the theory of surplus value, what Marx really did discover. Chapter 5, why the second volume of a contribution to the critique of political economy was not published. And the sections are, a few words about the first volume, the result of 15 years research, Quote, these parts still contain nothing about capital, unquote. The revolutionizing of science, the manuscript of 1861-63, work on the second part, January 1862, everything from the beginning again, a new stage in the investigations, the, quote, inner categories and their metamorphosed forms, the necessity for the completion of the theory of surplus value, the theory of profit in Grundrisse, the theory of average profit and of production price in the manuscript of 1861-63, from which theories of surplus value is derived, a statement by Engels. Chapter 6, which is titled From Value to Price of Production, and the sections are Market Value and Its Law of Motion, the, quote, false social value, and, quote, the discovery of production price, two kinds of competition and the twofold movement of the equalization of prices, the method of scientific abstraction in Marx's investigation. Chapter 7 is titled The Completion of the Theory of Surplus Value, and the sections are What did Marx have to prove? Rent as an illustration of the difference between value and price of production, the theory of capitalist monopoly, monopoly price and the theory of value, the breaking of monopoly in capitalist agriculture, examples of scientific abstraction in the theory of rent. Chapter 8 is titled How Capital, the book, took shape. And the sections are an artistic whole, logic and historical aspects, theories of surplus value, the beginning of the real work on capital. Quote, the second part, ... will appear independently under the title Capital, end quote. From 6 to 4 books, quote, confidentially, I indeed began Capital in exactly the opposite sequence, end quote. The theoretical and the historical part of Capital. Chapter 9 is titled Marx's Economic Theory and the Working Class. And the sections are the political economy of the working class, the dissemination of economic theory in the ranks of the working class, value, quote, value, price, and profit, and, quote, from political economy to economic policy, comparison with the 1840s, wage, labor, and capital, and manifesto of the Communist Party, quote, once the interconnection is grasped, and, quote, justification of the struggle of the workers for higher wages and a shorter working day, analysis of the value of labor power, quote, down with the wage system, exclamation point, end quote, scientific critique of Proudhonism. Conclusion, which is titled At the Center of the Historic Events of His Time. 40 years work on capital. Quote, I laugh at the so-called, quote, practical, end quote, men with their wisdom, end quote. The topicality of capital. Capital and present-day capitalism. The prospects of a new economic social formation. Marx's views of communist political economy. And this is a foreword to the German edition. And it says, it's written August 16th, 1867, 2 o'clock at night, so I guess it's a letter from Marx, and it says, Dear Fred, so I'm assuming that's to Engels. Dear Fred, I have just finished correcting the last sheet, 49th of the book, ... So this volume is finished. It was thanks to you alone that this became possible. Without your self-sacrifice for me, I could never possibly have done the enormous work for the 3 volumes. End quote. Okay, so actually, no, this is not a letter from Engels. That was just a quote that looked like... There's a quote actually before the thing that said August 16th, 1867. So that's the end of the quote. This letter from Marx to Engels marked the completion of the great work on capital. That is to say, 1967 marks the full century since this first volume of Capital was completed and published. It is consequently very satisfying that it is precisely in this year that German readers have the chance to read the important and interesting work on Marx by the Soviet economist V.S. Vygodski. After the publication of Capital, Friedrich Engels wrote that no book of such importance for the working class had been published prior to this. Its significance for the struggle of the working class, liberation from capitalist exploitation, and the building of socialist society is fully in accord with the energy which Marx spent on this book. He devoted 40 years of his life to it and, in the literal sense of the word, worked on it up to the last day of his life. As we know, Marx was only able to see the first volume through to the publication stage, and the other volumes appeared only after his death. The publication of these volumes of Capital was primarily the great merit of Engels. Without exaggeration, Capital may be termed as the major work of Marxism. A great deal has already been written about the history of this work. However, this book by V.S. Vygodski obviously has some important features. It provides a comprehensive idea of the conditions, publications, stages of development, and confrontations, which ultimately led to the formulation of the most important theoretical findings of the political economy of capitalism. Since Marx spent most of his time throughout his working life on Capital, and himself regarded Capital as his life's work, the history of the elaboration of this work reflects in many aspects biographical features of the man who created it. In addition to a popular presentation of the most important elements of Marx's economic theory, this book provides an excellent account of Marx's methods of work and research, which even today is of great topical significance for the Marxist-Leninist social sciences. Many facts help to show how Marx and Engels always combined their research work with practical revolutionary activities. With a large number of articles, lectures, contributions to discussions, and notes, they took part in the class struggle, exerted a decisive influence on it, checked the effectiveness of their theses in practice, and constantly drew new conclusions for generalization. It is precisely the story of how Capital was written which illustrates the relationship of the classic authors of Marxism with creative theoretical work. Friedrich Engels subsequently formulated this in the following words, quote, "Our theory is not a dogma, but the exposition of a process of evolution, and that process involves successive phases," end quote. Engels. V.S. Vygodski shows in very lucid manner how Marx, before he drew new theoretical conclusions, carried out an analysis of the bourgeois literature available. It was for this reason, of course, that he gave Capital the subtitle A Critique of Political Economy, but it is not only the fact of confrontation as a constant element of research work which is important here. The manner of this confrontation is of great significance too. Marx is always opposed to just arguing about dogmas, since in general this was of no great significance for the class struggle. Quote, "It is only by substituting for conflicting dogmas the conflicting facts and real antagonisms which form their hidden background that political economy can be transformed into a positive science," end quote. Marx. In the present book, many examples are used to show how Marx utilized abstraction as a method of research. Marx exposed the character of economic relations, the laws of economics, by eliminating all the phenomena which were of subordinate and secondary importance. But for Marx, this was never a case of abstraction pure and simple. The division into essential relations and relationships and subordinate phenomena was never something which was absolute for Marx, and Marx always proceeded from the specific circumstances and conditions in question. With changed circumstances and conditions, what was of subordinate importance now became an essential fact. Only through this was it possible for Marx in his theoretical work to exert a great influence on the course of the class struggle at the same time. Without doubt, this book by Vygodski will be a great help to all students of Marxism-Leninism in understanding Marx's work and methods of research, and understanding of Marx's work and methods of research is of great practical importance for us, since even today it is not possible to come to new theoretical findings in the social sciences without utilizing these methods. As noted already, 100 years have passed since the first volume of Capital was published. It is scarcely possible to count these bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideologists who in this volume have ascertained or predicted the death of the theories developed in it. V.S. Vygodski quite rightly refers to those, quote, great, end quote, economists of the, quote, establishment who attempted to deal a death blow to the theories of Marx while he was still alive, such as Rocher and others, and who are now totally forgotten. But now, a century later, there is hardly any other theoretical work which has been translated into so many languages, distributed in so many countries of the world, and has been printed in such big editions. With its vitality and social topicality, Capital is continuing to make an impact on people all over the world. The genesis of Marx is that Marx was able to recognize the essential nature of capitalism and to formulate the laws governing capitalism at a time when it was beginning to emerge on an international scale. This is why, in the course of history, the significance and influence of this great theoretical achievement has not faded but constantly increased. Vygotsky examines how Capital was written. Of no less interest would be a record of events since it was published, for this confirms that Marx's theories have not only stimulated science, but have increasingly become a guide for the practical shaping of the present. The greatest confirmation of this correctness of Marx's theories, in association with Lenin's theory of imperialism and the socialist revolution, came almost exactly 50 years after the appearance of the first volume of, quote, Capital, with the Great Socialist Revolution. On the 7th of November 1917, the working class of Russia, in alliance with the impoverished peasantry and under the leadership of the party of the Bolsheviki, overthrew capitalism in their country, set up the first state controlled by the workers and peasants, and initiated the transition of mankind from capitalism to socialism. And that preface was from Otto Reinhold. Let's see if that's somebody on German Wikipedia. Wikipedia says Otto Reinhold lived from 1925 to 2016, was a German economist. In the service of the SED, Socialist Unity Party, Otto Reinhold was instrumental in shaping the ideological direction of the GDR. So that's the end of the preface and the introductory materials. Not the introduction proper, but the opening stuff for Vygotsky's The Story of a Great Discovery. Thank you so much for listening. Hey everybody, this is the introduction, which is distinct from like the preface and like the introductory stuff at the beginning of the book. This is the actual introduction of the Story of a Great Discovery, How Marx Wrote Capital, by Vitali Vygodski. So, the headings for the introduction are: Is it necessary to know the background of capital? The main stages. Why is the period from 1850 to 1863 so interesting? Marx's creative laboratory. And the introduction is titled, Instead of an Introduction, How Capital Was Created. Like people, books also have their destiny and their biography, and we decided to follow the history of capital in Capital's culminating period from 1850 to 1863. Although none of the volumes of Capital had yet appeared, it was nevertheless in this period that Marx had evolved all the major parts of his theory of economics. The history of Capital is essentially the history of the background of this theory and how it was evolved. The history of the economic doctrine of Marx is so dramatic and so full of facts that it makes very interesting reading and is not at all just for those specializing in the history of Marxism. But why should one know the history of Marx's economic theory anyway? Isn't it enough to study this theory of economics itself, as set out in the 4 volumes of Capital? This history must be known, since the economic doctrine of Marx can only be correctly understood in that doctrine's development, in its evolution. Otherwise, it will certainly be understood only in a dogmatic sense, i.e. in a way which is distorted, false, and superficial. Studying the history of Capital provides an opportunity of fixing the periods of time in which Marx wrote the individual volumes of Capital. It will be found that the manuscript of the 4th volume, which I'm guessing is referring to Theories of Surplus Value, was completed at the beginning of the 1860s, and that of the 3rd volume halfway through the same decade. Yeah, I think that's what he was referring to, Theories of Surplus Value. Because I think, I can't remember the exact dates, but I know Theories of Surplus Value comes from like the, I think 1861 to 63 manuscripts, and then Volume 3, so Surplus Value comes from those 2 years, and then Volume 3 comes from, I think, 1864 to 65 manuscripts, and that was published recently. The 1864 to 65 manuscripts were published by Haymarket Press. I think it's their 100th volume in the Historical Materialism book series, with like a pretty decent introduction by Fred Mosley. Anyway, where the hell am I? Just wanted to show how smart I am. The first volume was published in 1867, and the second was prepared for printing by Engels, mainly on the basis of manuscripts compiled by Marx in the 1870s. So Marx wrote Capital from back to front, so to speak, from the 4th volume to the 1st, although the 2nd volume does not fit in this scheme of things. Because Capital Volume 2, I think Capital Volume 2, I'm not sure, but I know like there was important pieces added to Volume 2 in the 1870s. I don't know if all of Volume 2 was written in the 1870s, though. It will subsequently be seen that this really was the case, and we will try to show the reasons for this. For the start, it may be noted that the knowledge and understanding of this fact, which is so important for the history of capital, is also of significance for the thorough study of this work. Marx's economic theory was developed in a rather tumultuous fashion. Its level of development, its degree of maturity, changed very greatly only in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. Not only in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, but also in the period of each decade. This is also reflected in the terminology used by Marx. By studying the history of capital, we can follow how Marx elaborated Marx's economic doctrine, how Marx discovered the laws of the capitalist mode of production, how Marx overcame the shortcomings of bourgeois political economy, and how Marx revolutionized the science of economics from the standpoint of the working class. Studying the history of Marx's theory of economics reveals his creative method and takes us into his, quote, creative laboratory, end quote. Mastery of Marx's methodology of scientific research is the key problem if one wishes to acquire Marxist-Leninist theory in a creative way and apply it correctly and explain the phenomena of life in the human society of our age. In the Soviet Union, V.V. Adoratsky, V.K. Brushlinsky, I.A. Leontiev, A.L. Rule, D.I. Rosenberg, and other scholars have devoted and are devoting great attention to the history of evolution of Marxist theory of economics and have thrown a great deal of light on the subject. I think, I'm not exactly sure, I don't know who any of these other people are, but Adoratsky, I think, is who replaced David Ryazanov at the Marx Institute in the Soviet Union. I think he himself, though, also fell foul of Stalin. As you know, David Ryazanov was murdered. One of the most important Marx scholars of the 20th century was murdered by Stalin, or the Soviet Union. And I'm not sure if Adoratsky was as well or not. I might be thinking of someone else, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. That he came after Ryazanov. The history of the evolution of Marx's economic doctrine is somewhat complicated. This has led to a lot of arguments among investigators, since what has to be done here is to classify this history into scientific periods, to break it down into a number of stages in agreement with the level which Marx had reached in each of these stages when elaborating his theory. To illustrate this, the various schemes may be quoted which historians of Marxism from the German Democratic Republic have put forward as a basis for assigning dates to the various periods. Footnote. A list of publications by historians of the GDR on this question is given by V. Tschrer, can't remember how to pronounce that guy's name, Zur Marx Engels Forschung in der DDR auf dem Gebiet der politischen Ökonomie, Beiträge zur Geschichte der deutschen Arbeiterbewegung, Sonderheft. Beiträge zur Marx-Engels Forschung in der DDR. I don't know how to pronounce letters in German. I don't know how to pronounce anything in German, but I like to give it a shot. Professor Adam Lemnitz devised the development of Marx's theory of economics into 4 stages: 1843 to 1848/49, 1850 to 1860, 1861 to 1867, and 1868 to 1883. A. Benari and H. Grahl divided into 3 stages: 1864 to 46, 1847 to 1860, 1861 to 1863. Finally, Wolfgang Jahn suggests the following periods: 1842 to 1846, 1847 to 1862, 1863 to 1867, and 1867 to 1895. I know that Michael Heinrich speaks of Wolfgang Jahn and Vitali Vygodski. I don't know what their particular contributions are, though. But maybe by the end of this book, we'll know something, huh? It will be noted that there is a considerable variation in the date suggested, and we would like to add that none of the schemes proposed seems to us to be completely acceptable. In our view, the real criterion which would have to be taken as a basis for dating the various periods in the history of the economic doctrine of Marx is the level which Marx had attained at any given period in the elaboration of his theory, especially the theory of value and the surplus value theory. How is it that historians have come to such divergent conclusions? A special characteristic of Marx's creative method was that in the field of political economy, his work always progressed in 2 parallel directions: the critique of capitalism, especially the critique of bourgeois and petty bourgeois theories, and the elaboration of his own theory of economics. In Marx's economic research, the solving of these 2 tasks was really a single process. This characteristic of Marx's method of research is also reflected in the dual title which Marx gave to his work on economics: Capital Critique of Political Economy. Marx originally intended to call his work Critique of Political Economy, or On the Critique of Political Economy. In the letter of the 22nd of February 1858 to Lassalle, Marx characterized his work in these words, quote, "The first work in question is Critique of the Economic Categories, or, if you like, the system of bourgeois economy critically presented," end quote. It is both a description of the system and, through the description, a criticism of the system. In this connection, the argument of A. Benari and H. Grahl does not hold water at all, since they assert that between 1847 and 1860, Marx exploded the bourgeois theories of political economy, and from 1861 to 1883 worked out the Marxist scheme of political economy. Attempts to split up the homogeneous process in which Marx, elaborated his theory of economics led to a distortion of the actual development of Marxism. If we take the period from 1850 to 1863, we assume that it was precisely in this period that Marx evolved his theories of value, surplus value, average profit, and price of production, which supplemented his surplus value theory. Everything which Marx did before this period, i.e. between 1843 and 1849, in the field of political economy, may be designated as the prehistory of his theory of economics. First of all, a few words about this prehistory. In the development of the Marxist theory of economics, the 1840s are an important period. During this time, Marx and Engels worked out their dialectical and materialist view of history in such works as the Philosophic Economic Manuscripts, The Holy Family, The Position of the Working Class in England, The German Ideology, The Poverty of Philosophy, Wage, Labor, and Capital, Speech on the Question of Free Trade, Manifesto of the Communist Party, and others. They extended dialectical materialism to the understanding of human society. Just as a side note, that's a very just as a side note, if you know whatever you know about the history if you listen to the book I put up by Z.A. Jordan, that statement right there, that concept that Marx and Engels extended dialectical materialism to the understanding of human society. For one, it has the premise that Marx and Engels were of the same mind, because of course dialectical materialism, it's kind of like founding text, is the Anti-Düring, Engels' Anti-Düring, which is not by Marx, and also, but that's that was a fundamental core tenet of Stalinist Marx reception, is that dialectical materialism, historical materialism, was an application of dialectical materialism to the understanding of human society. And I believe, if my Marxist history is correct, I believe that the dialectical materialism was only a term that was first used by Plekhanov. So it has a history in the Russian radical sphere. And to my understanding, from what I know, is like a lot of the philosophical discussions. Maybe I'm wrong; someone could correct me. But a lot of the stuff that tried to turn Marxism into a kind of like, maybe not turn Marxism, but emphasized, I guess, like the philosophical side, or like the philosophical in the sense of like metaphysical presuppositions of Marxism, and kind of like. Building off, really kind of like taking Anti-Düring as its like foundational text was really something that was very like important in the Russian context, right? As opposed, if you think of like, to my understanding, that's not really quite as important, or maybe it is, or maybe I'm just talking on my ass, but it doesn't seem quite as important to people like Luxemburg or like Kautsky or anything, people in the German sphere. What seems like more important to them is more like social questions of the critique of political economy, questions of history, and so forth, as opposed to social sciences, as opposed to philosophy. Anyway, where the hell am I? From the totality of social relations, Marx and Engels emphasized the material economic relations, the relations of production, which are formed independently of the will and consciousness of people, as the original and determining factors, in contrast to the ideological relations which pass through the human consciousness before they emerge. The relations of production as such are determined by the level of development of the productive forces. And that's like classic, like orthodox Marxism right there. The notion that the relations of production are kind of like determined in this kind of or based in a strictly technological, like this technological reductionism, I guess, is like orthodox Marxism, like par excellence, right? Whereas later people, for instance, would emphasize subsumption, right? The way that a certain productive relations change the productive forces. And big important text in that would be like the results of the immediate production process as a whole, where Marx talks about real and formal subsumption. That would be important for people who don't take this kind of like technological determinist view, which would be criticized from like all quarters, so including like people like value form analysts, right? But also, and people coming from the Frankfurt School, but I think also importantly, people coming from political Marxism, right? I think that's a big thing with like Robert Brenner and like Ellen Mason's Wood, is the subsumption of, say, like agriculture to the imperatives of market, fundamentally changing how agriculture was agricultural production was accomplished technologically. The social forms kind of dictating the productive relations. I mean, the relations of production dictating the technical content of the productive forces. Yeah. By emphasizing the relations of production and isolating the relations of production from all other social relations, Marx and Engels were enabled to discover the common features in the social development of different countries and to generalize the economic relations which prevailed in these countries in the concept of the economic formation of society, the objective character of the relations of production, which are dependent on the level of development of the productive forces, enabled the development of the economic formation of society to be considered as a historical process, i.e. strictly in accordance with the natural laws of development. Right, and that's another thing. That's another Marxist-Leninist thing. It's not, obviously, it can be found in Marx and Engels, but like the idea of this kind of like positivist conception in which social relations are can be viewed in the same way as you can view natural sciences. Anyway, the objective character of the relations of production, which are dependent on the level of development of the productive forces, enables the development of the economic formation of society to be considered as a historical process, i.e. strictly in accordance with the natural laws of development. As a consequence of this, the science of society was given a scientific foundation for the very first time. This was, by and large, the clement of genius in the, quote, idea of materialism in sociology, end quote, with which Marx and Engels achieved prominence in the first half of the 1840s. At this point, mention must be made of the predecessors of Marx and Engels, of Hegel, who attempted to describe the internal development of the history of human society, of the French historians Thierry, Guizot, and Mignet, who discussed the English Revolution of the 17th century and the French Revolution of the 18th from the standpoint of class struggle, and of the English economists Petty, Smith, and Ricardo, who investigated the economic anatomy of the classes of bourgeois society. All this justified Lenin in characterizing Marxism as the highest level of development of all the really great achievements of the historical, economic, and philosophical sciences of Europe. The materialist conception of society advanced by Marx and Engels was at first only a scientific hypothesis which still had to be proved. Quote, naturally, for the time being, end quote, wrote Lenin, quote, it was only a hypothesis, but a hypothesis which first created the possibility of a strictly scientific approach to historical and social problems, end quote. Lenin. What the Friends of the People are and how they fight the Social Democrats. Without having been fully demonstrated at the time, this hypothesis enabled Marx and Engels as early as the 1840s to develop a consistent criticism of bourgeois society from the proletarian standpoint, which was totally different from a petty bourgeois one. Already in the works referred to above, which were produced during the 1840s, Marx and Engels set out the arguments for their doctrine of class struggle. Marx and Engels revealed the nature of class antagonisms in capitalist society and demonstrated that socialism is the unavoidable result of the economic laws operative in capitalist society. They showed that capitalism in the shape of the working class is its own gravedigger. They also proved that the periodic crises of overproduction are the expression of the irreconcilable contradictions of capitalism and are inevitable. From the materialist conception of history, there also followed the exceptionally important position of economic theory in the system of Marxism as a whole. When the relations of production are the original and determining relations, it is only the investigation of these economic relations and the analysis of the laws of the functioning and development of the economic formation of society which enable the real driving forces of social development to be identified and the tendencies of this development to be indicated. This is why Marx had formulated the basic theses of the dialectic and materialist conception of history. The dialectic and materialist concept of history devoted the whole of his attention to the investigation of the relations of production of the capitalist formation of society. Lenin made the following remarks about this, quote, "Now, however, Marx, who had expressed this hypothesis in the 40s, set out to study the factual ... material. Marx took one of the social economic formations, the system of commodity production, and on the basis of a vast mass of data, which he studied for not less than 25 years, gave a most detailed analysis of the laws governing the functioning of this formation and its development." End quote. Lenin. In the explanation of the capitalist formation of society, Marx concentrates on the relations of production, but also follows the superstructure phenomena corresponding to these relations of production. Quote, "Now, since the appearance of capital, Marx's Capital, the materialist conception of history is no longer a hypothesis, but a scientifically proven proposition." End quote. Lenin. Marx's intensive work in the field of political economy began in July 1850. The study of the, quote, "factual material," end quote, as Lenin put it, lasted until the autumn of 1857. Marx studied bourgeois political economy and the history of economic relations and investigated capitalist reality in its actual and specific form. The numerous, quote, notebooks give an idea of Marx's activities during this period. In the period from October 1857 to May 1858, Marx wrote a manuscript of about 50 printed sheets, the result of 7 years of research and the first draft of what was to be, quote, Capital, or Marx's Capital. In this manuscript, Marx elaborated the most important aspect of Marx's theory of economics for the first time, the theory of value and the theory of surplus value. Engels said that Marx had made two great discoveries. The first was the materialist conception of history, the second the theory of surplus value. It was precisely while working on the manuscript of 1857 to 58 that Marx made his second great discovery, the theory of surplus value. And if you don't know, 1857 manuscript is what we know as the Grundrisse. In 1859, Marx published the first results of this research work. This was part one of his book, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which at first only contained a description of his theory of value. In 1861, Marx began the preparation of the second volume of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, but soon interrupted this work and started on a great new program of research work, a critical review of the entire field of bourgeois political economy. The result of this work was the mighty manuscript of 200 printed sheets of 1861 to 63, which contains the first systematically formulated version of all 4 volumes of Capital. While working on this manuscript, Marx developed his theory of average profit and of the production process, thus putting the finishing touches to his theory of surplus value. From 1864 to 1865, Marx compiled new versions of the first 3 volumes of Capital and then began to prepare the first volume for printing. While working on his theory of economics, Marx also worked out the structure of the future Capital. The elaboration of the structure of Capital, as regards both the complicated nature of the task and its significance, can certainly be ranked with Marx's great discoveries in the field of economic theory. Marx intended, quote, theoretically to give the bourgeoisie a blow from which it will never recover, end quote. Marx. Letter to C. Klings, 4th of October, 1864. This blow had to be delivered with a perfect weapon, perfect not only in content but also in form. This weapon was Marx's Capital. When studying the history of Marx's Capital, we should always bear in mind the apt character sketch which Friedrich Engels gave of his great friend when he said that Marx is not at all a bookworm but first and foremost a revolutionary. The remark will help us to avoid too narrow an approach when following the evolution of Marx's economic doctrine. His theoretical work was always subordinated to the interests of the working class, to the interests of the proletarian revolution. The thorough economic studies of 1850 to 1857 were just as much directly associated with the defeat of the revolution of 1848-49 as the preparation of the manuscripts of 1857-58, and the elaboration of the surplus value theory with the expectation of a new revolutionary crisis. But there was no revolution in Marx, who had been working feverishly to finish the basic theses of his theory of economics before the, quote, flood, end quote, before the outbreak of the revolution, once again turned to the detailed investigation of economic problems, regardless of Engels' persistent requests to publish the theoretical results already obtained, despite the turn of events. It was not until 1867, in the first volume of Capital, that Marx published his theory of surplus value, i.e. a good 10 years after the theory of surplus value's elaboration! Exclamation point. This was an instance of Marx's conscientiousness in theoretical matters. The period from 1850 to 1863, which we have taken as the subject of our observations, supplies us with all that we need to learn about Marx's method of work and his, quote, creative laboratory, end quote. This includes his notebooks and his draft manuscripts, his published works, and his extensive correspondence. All these works and documents enable us to follow the development of Marx's economic ideas in detail and to reproduce his train of thought in full. And that's the end of the introduction to Vitali Vygodski's theory, The Story of a Great Discovery, How Marx Wrote Capital.